Hey guys, I wanted to take a moment to share some of my testimony with y'all. There are some of you on here that know me, know about my story, but there are many of you that don't. So I wanted to take the time to tell you a little bit about my past, where I came from, and how I became a Christian. I wasn't always a Christian. I think that's true for everybody up to some point in their life, even children. But even much of my adult life, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. We didn't go to church. I didn't know really anything about religion, let alone Christianity. In fact, my younger sister was the only one that went to church, and she went devoutly. And at the time, my thought on that was, it was just a group of friends that she was with, and that's just what they did. But I can tell you that my little sister has indeed stayed true to her faith and has bestowed that to her family with a godly husband. But I never really thought about Christianity growing up. I mean, I stepped foot in churches. I went from time to time, mainly because I had friends that went with their parents. But the idea of Jesus and a Savior and that whole world that encompasses what Christianity is never set in on me. To me, it was no different than hearing stories about Odin and other types of religions, most of which I had just, heard through a lot of the music that I listened to growing up in the 80s. But I had always been probably, a decent enough kid and young adult. I never really drank. I didn't do drugs, not really. But if I just fast forward a little bit, there was a time in my life where I got into some trouble, big trouble actually, so much so that I was sentenced and sent to prison for doing something that obviously I shouldn't have done, and that was forging fictitious documents. Not just forging fictitious documents, but making those documents, making them in such a way that they would pass every scanning system to authorize those documents as being legitimate. I focused on banks and large companies, forging fictitious documents to gain something that I didn't have a right to. I spent 7 years in prison out of 2 terms. The first was about a year or so. During that first year was when I had access to a large library. The prison was really more of a camp. But this prison, it had a good library. I loved books and I loved to study and learn, and I'd always been that way. So here at this prison, I began to study religions, as I had never done that before. Christianity too. I didn't know anything about Christianity, not really. I didn't read the Bible during that time at all. I was just intrigued about the argument for religions. And I remember when studying Christianity specifically, I came across some flawless arguments that surprised even me. And in my mind, I thought that out of all of the different religions that I had studied, Christianity was the only one that didn't seem to implode on itself, as it were. The time that I was in prison for that year, after studying basically just the evidences for Christianity, I read everything but the Bible during that time. But someone that I got to know very well in prison, he gave me the gospel. And, this was during that first year, and I believed. At least I thought that I believed. Because when I got out, I went back to the same thing without even a thought of Christ, the gospel, and even the study that I had done on Christianity, completely forgotten. It was nothing more than an intellectual response, but that was just me, right? Everything was an intellectual response. So I said I spent a total of 7 years in prison. So obviously I went back, and I'll get to that. But I don't regret any of that time that I did. I regret the crime, for sure, but I don't regret the time. I recognize that that was the place that God used in that time in my life to open my eyes. When I went back, when I went back, I wasn't searching or looking for God, not at all. I was on no quest of for any kind of spirituality. I had completely dismissed everything that I had learned in the first year in prison as just something to do to pass away time. But unbeknownst to me, God had another plan. He was calling me. He was pulling me in, literally dragging me in, kicking and screaming. I've always had an analytical mind, a philosophical mind. Some have said, about me. And in fact, my favorite subjects in school were always English and literature. I read all the classics, the poetry, a lot of stuff that people found boring, I loved. And I'll always remember that that what began or led me on what I call a journey from my selfishness of unbelief to true belief. It wasn't from that first year that I did in prison, but really not long after I got back into prison. I remember asking myself a question. I was alone in my cell. I was alone with my thoughts, and I remember asking myself this question: what if you didn't believe and you were wrong? That was an interesting question to me, because if you reverse that question around, the answer is nothing, right? Nothing. But if you ask that question the right way, it means everything. And so that question, initially, it took me by surprise, because I didn't even know for sure exactly what I meant. Believe in what? What does that even mean? Then I remembered and began thinking about that first year in prison. And then I remembered looking back on the few times that I did go to church as a teenager, and I remembered some things there, and I realized that the question I was asking was about Jesus, right? Jesus. And in that moment, I wasn't looking in my loneliness for some sort of redemptive way out of my mind sitting there in that cell. It was an honest question that led me on a journey. So I asked the guard for a Bible. It was a somewhat used New King James Bible, paperback, no study notes, just the Bible. And then I asked for a dictionary that was very worn and tattered, old. But I didn't know where to start in the Bible. I just remember thumbing through it, the first time, pushing the pages back and forth, just looking at it. And I didn't know what I was looking for. So I started in the New Testament, and I read the New Testament in maybe 2 days. And to be honest, that's not really a great achievement. I mean, the New Testament is not really that big of a book. I've always said it's more like a large pamphlet than a book. It's actually pretty small for a book. So I would argue that's true about the entire Bible. The Bible is not really that big of a book, at least not in respect of the size of books that I'd always been used to reading. But it was really John's Gospel that stuck out to me of the first 4 books of the New Testament. And then when I had got to Acts, I started to see things a little more clearly. I thought, there's something about this book that's different. There's truth here. I spent all that time during my first year of prison trying to read evidences of Christianity without reading the Bible one time. What I saw just then after reading the book of Acts, that the Bible has its own evidences within it. The way these men died for a supposed lie, their families too. There's testimony to this truth in the Bible about itself. Why would Paul, a man of his stature, risk it all? And so it goes on and on and on like this. And so here I am, in prison, in a cell, with the Bible, just a Bible and a dictionary. And I began to remember for the first time some of what I had heard in church all those many years ago. And I was only there in church as a teenager to hang out with my friends. But I remembered. And it was then in that cell with just a Bible that I gave my life to Christ. No minister, no chaplain, just me with the Bible and my own pleading to Jesus to save me. And something in me changed, not overnight, but do you know how you know the Holy Spirit is within you? You see something of His glory, don't you? And I saw something of His glory when my heart changed, my mind changed, my desires changed, and I didn't want to put that book down. I read that book from cover to cover for 2 years before I was transferred to another facility. It was the only book that I had, cover to cover, from cover to cover. I would develop a system where I would sit down every day and read through one book of the Bible in one sitting. And then in the New Testament, I would read every book multiple times. I would take, say, the Gospel of Luke, and I would read the first half of the book every day for 15 days, then read the second half for 15 days, and on it went. And I did that with every book of the New Testament, and some of the epistles like Galatians, I read the whole book every day for 15 days. And I did this because I wanted to soak it in. I wanted to understand what God meant in His Word, what He was communicating to me. And what I found is that when you do this, it forces context on you. There's no extra biblical books. It's just you and the Bible. And of course, with an understanding of knowledge of literature, which I had, that helped me tremendously. I understood literature, poetry, allegory, all of that. The only area that I wasn't familiar with was apocalyptic literature. That was new to me. Maybe that's why when I got out of prison, eschatology became a massive interest of mine. And someday, probably soon, I'll do a series on eschatology, end times. It's fascinating to me. But quick disclaimer: there's nothing wrong with extra biblical books if you have the right books, and I would be the first to say that. So it's been said that to me that prison was my seminary, and I believe that's true. After reading the Bible for those 2 years, I was finally moved to a different facility, and that facility had a large regular library and also a large chapel library. And I remember being in the chapel reading one day and overhearing two gentlemen having a conversation about how you could lose your salvation. And I thought, well, that's strange. What do they mean by that? I've always been bold and forthright, never the one afraid of conversation or confrontation. So I turned around to those two men. I'll always remember this. I said, I don't know what Bible you're reading, but mine doesn't say that. Needless to say, we had an interesting conversation, the three of us, and I was able to take them through the Bible. And afterward, the chaplain, he had overheard that conversation and talked to me about a job at the chapel. And it wasn't long after that I started preaching on some of the Sunday morning services for the inmates. But that conversation with those two men interested me to learn more about what others thought about the Bible and these different perspectives. I was completely ignorant of knowing that there were different perspectives. Yes, I knew there were different churches and all of that, but it never really occurred to me that there were so many different positions on how people view certain doctrinal matters in the Bible. At this point, I didn't know any theological terms. I wasn't influenced by any theological position. I I never grew up in the church. I didn't have any persuasions. All I had was my Bible. So I just began taking books off the shelf, and there was just so much that I disagreed with, and I didn't expect that, and I expected more like-mindedness, at least to some degree, and there was, but there was some major separation in views, and I personally felt that I wasn't wrong about what I read in the Bible those years. I was reading some of these books, and as I was reading them, the arguments would begin to form in my mind to refute these claims. To me, it was just so clear and so obvious in so many ways and on so many levels that, I learned, for example, that there are entire denominations that base their theology on one single verse taken completely out of context. That there is an entire denomination that attempts to separate or make a distinction between that of a believer and a disciple. And I never saw that in the Bible, never. And I still strongly disagree with that. I just get passionate about these things. Truth is important to me, and I'm always willing to learn and grow. I've corrected even some of what I had believed that wasn't accurate. I'm always willing to do that to conform my mind to the Bible, but I'm also always willing to call people out on a theology or a position they hold that is not biblical. That these truths are evident and crystal clear. I will always do that. There is room for disagreement, but when I see something that is such an obvious error, I have to say something. It's in my DNA. When I started working in the chapel at the prison, I began to study biblical theology, systematic theology, historical theology, philosophy, apologetics, and the outpouring that I received from ministries and publishing companies was just amazing. I was flooded with books, Christian academic books, and I loved it every step of the way. And because of my own discipline in reading the Bible, when I became a Christian, this helped me to filter some of the different understandings theologically. And I would study up to 15 hours a day sometimes. And I mean, think about it. What better place for God to grab a hold of me and use me in this way to prepare me for something when all I have is time? That's it. I all this time. So, it just became a passion of mine to study different perspectives that other Christians had and how they came to those conclusions. And I knew that it would be a false way to study if I only studied the opposition from someone that held my own position. I really wanted to learn why they came to those conclusions, though we read the same scripture. So I always studied those different various positions from those who held those positions, so I could understand them accurately and honestly without the possibility of miscommunication, miscommunicating that why they take these positions and how they come to them, even though we may differ. But in so many ways, I thank God for saving me at the moment He did, and the life that He would lead me into from there, raising two strong, intellectual boys that are now men, young men, and that I was able to teach them God's truth, and that they have not departed from it. That God has given me a wife, a beautiful wife, that even through all of my faults and my sins, she still loves me, and I am not perfect, and I have stumbled, and I've gotten right back up, but never by my own strength, but by looking to the one that gives life. For the past few years, I haven't done any teaching or preaching. A friend once said to me, "Carl, you have so much knowledge in there and you're wasting it. Why are you being so selfish?" And I just blew that off. until recently. And recently, as many of you know, a group of us had gotten together to form what we would call the Bridge Church. And I don't want to get into the details there on that, but that led to this ministry. And so here we are, right, getting to know one another. So let's do just that. Let's get to know one another. Those of you who are local, let's get together for coffee and have meals together, fellowship together. And for those of you, that live further away, invite people into this group that live in your community, so that you too can start, coming together where you live, start talking about and discussing what we're studying here. And that might lead you into your own conversations, but reach out to others in your own communities as well. I would love for some of you to do what I started here with this specific Facebook group. If you can preach and teach in a way that educates God's people, you can link this ministry to your own for a bigger ministry together. That's why I called this of Jasper, because that's where we're centrally located, right? Jasper, Texas. Even though the goal is also to reach far and abroad, I encourage you to start your own, the Bridge Bible Group of Houston, the Bridge Bible Group of Dallas, the Bridge Bible Group of Ironwood, Michigan, or whatever city it is. Let's link together and start something bigger with a bigger community to reach out to our local communities. That's the vision. Thank you for being a part of this with me, with us. On Sunday, I'm going to continue the series I started on marriage. We'll be getting into the book of Revelation that day. I'm very excited about that, as well as some other places in the Bible. But please join us. Just one final thought. I was persuaded to make this group private rather than public. Anyone can be invited to preview the group before they join, but I was persuaded to make it private to protect us from spammers coming into the group, seeing your information and all of that, right? Looking at your personal accounts. That's why I set the group to private. If you have any questions, feel free to write them in the comments or private message me. Let's talk. Right? Thank you all, and God bless.